Welcome everyone to this section of the session. Here we'll be looking at needs assessment, a very crucial step in every project. A needs assessment helps us to identify the most important problems before we begin designing solutions, as we have learned earlier. In our contest as Lead for Ghana Associates, what it means is that we need to take the time to understand the real issues affecting our students, their learning, teacher performance, or community engagement before we jump into implementing projects. And once you do a needs assessment, it ensures that whatever interventions you are designing are evidence based and they directly respond to the actual needs, not based on assumptions. In the next few slides, we'll go through 5 key steps um, of doing needs assessment. That includes identifying the purpose, defining your target audience, gathering data, analyzing and interpreting that data, and then finally how you are using your data or your findings to define your project objectives and interventions. The first step is to identify the purpose. Why? This is where you define why you are carrying out the needs assessment. And having a clear purpose gives your project direction. It ensures that your data collection and analysis is focused on one thing. So just ask yourself, what am I trying to solve in my school or in my community? And who will even benefit from the results? What decisions will this information help me to make? So, for instance, you have been placed at Adewano Anglican Primary and you notice that students struggle to read or the fluency levels are so low. Now, you want to understand why grade 2 learners, for instance, in this school struggle with reading fluency so that you can design a targeted reading support program for these students. And you should be able to make this statement actionable. It should point to what data you have to collect, who to collect the data from, and how you are using this data. And I encourage all of you as you go into designing your needs assessment to pay particular attention to why you are doing this. So, in essence, you need to clarify the problem or the gap you seek to address. And in doing that, you need to link those goals to your final focus or your project design. And once your goal is very clear or your purpose is clear, you can move on to find out or ask yourself who is your targeted audience or who are you doing this for? Who are you collecting the data from? You need to identify individuals, groups or institutions or communities that your project targets. We usually divide these stakeholders into two, the primary and the secondary. Those who are directly affected by your project and those who may not be, but their input is very important in your project. Like I mentioned, your primary audience or your primary stakeholders are those that are directly affected by the issue. In this case, using the Adewano example, they'll be your students. Your secondary audiences are those who influence the outcome. They're not really affected by it, but they influence the outcome of your project. And this may include other teachers in the school, it could include parents, school heads, or even community leaders and some community members. And you need to be very clear about these groups, and that will help you to design the appropriate tools and even the questions you need to present to each group to help you in your project implementation. So, for instance, if your project focuses on foundational literacy, Your students and your classroom teachers are your primary audience, while the parents and the head teachers or even the community members become your secondary audience because they help you to sustain your efforts. It's also important to consider vulnerable and underrepresented groups, such as students with disabilities or those who are often absent. Mostly, when we do needs assessments, there's a likelihood to exclude these people. But for the sake of inclusivity and as Lead for Ghana associates, we encourage you to involve all, including those who are underrepresented. And once you are done with your audience or your primary and your secondary stakeholders, you need to think about how I am going to collect this information from them. Under the data gathering process, this is where you decide what kind of information you will collect and how you will collect it. And under this, we have the qualitative and the quantitative data. The quantitative data mostly dealing with numbers, and the qualitative data dealing with people's opinions and their experiences. So this is where you gather all the data you need, be it in numbers or be it in experiences. The quantitative data might include the diagnostic tests. For instance, the current associates are taking a foundational literacy and numeracy diagnostics test. They are running a test to find out or gather data about their student levels when it comes to literacy and numeracy. We also take student attendance records, and that's an example of a quantitative data, or even classroom performance averages that associates put in the student trackers. These are all forms of data that we collect to help us make meaningful or evidence-based decisions at the end of it all. And the goal is to use multiple types of data collection tools. So it's important to focus not just on quantitative data gathering or qualitative, but a mix of these two tools helps your findings to be very well rounded and credible. So it's important to blend the two. So whether you need to take data quantitatively or you want to ask questions, interviews, give out surveys, it's very important to test it out on a small number of people or at least run it by someone to see how you can scale it on to a large group of people. So it's important to test or pilot your tools with just a few participants just to make sure that your questions are clear and you are on the same page with your participants. But it's also very important ethically to seek the consent or permission of your school leadership or even the participants, explaining the purpose for your assessment, explaining the purpose of the survey or the interview or even the focus group discussion before you proceed. Seek their consent before you proceed with the data collection. And a typical example of data collection exercise we had is the just ended school culture survey, the school climate survey, the community leadership survey, and for the new associates, that will be the likes of the foundational literacy and numeracy diagnostics and the attendance tracking you've been tasked to do. And together, these tools will help you get a school level or student level picture of their performance and their attendance, for instance. So, data gathering is a very essential part of needs assessments that you have to pay focus, that you need to pay attention to. It's more like the heart of your project. If your data gathering process goes wrong, the information may not be credible or you may not be able to gather accurate information that informs the project you decide to implement in the long run. So it's highly important to take the data gathering process very critical. Also, we are looking at making decisions that are evidence based. So it's very important to invest in this process. Now you have collected your data from your participants, either using qualitative or quantitative or both. You have all of this information, but the next thing to do is to make meaning out of it. And that's where you analyze and interpret your data. You do this to study the trends and outcomes of the data or your response, the responses you had from your participants to help you mark those responses against the existing standards. So, for instance, if you run a foundational literacy and numeracy diagnostics, and the end goal is to implement an FLN intervention program in your school, you know that the benchmark um, for to say that a student is a fluent reader, they need to be able to read about 40 words per minute. After running the diagnostics, how many of your students were able to read um, sentences 40 words per minute? Or how many of them went below 20 words per minute? And so you go according to the standards or benchmarks that have been set to identify who a fluent reader is. You do this for all your students. You identify the trends, whether a huge number of them are below the required marks or um, are above the required marks. And that is where you can make a decision on the kind of intervention these students need. And in the case of qualitative data, you need to ask a lot of whys. You need to find out why some responses are recurring, and that would help you to make the most informed decisions. Again, you need to summarize after you have looked for trends and studied the responses that have come. You need to summarize it and possibly draw charts or make charts out of um, the responses so that it's visually stimulating and answers the questions easily, or people can just look at the chat and make meaning out of the situation on the ground or make meaning out of the data that you have collected. The key thing to keep in mind is that for the quantitative data, try as much as possible to find averages of your results. So, for instance, the average number of students that were able to read fluently. And then for your qualitative data, it's important to ask why, probe further. Why is this situation happening? Is it as a result of the lack of textbooks? Is it that students do not have a lot of engagement times at home? Or they do not do a lot of personal studies at home? Probe further to validate the responses you have had. Another way of validating these responses is to run your charts or summary by other teachers. These are your findings from the survey or the focus group discussions you had. And could that be a possible reflection of the situation on the ground? Then you can tell that you are making headway. So it's important to share the findings with other teachers or people who matter. In this case, sometimes your secondary stakeholders. You could share them with school authorities, and that is when you proceed to use your findings. Now that you have gathered the data you need about student performance or their fluency levels and what is contributing to the low literacy rate. How are you using the findings? What sort of intervention are you proposing? You have the evidence and the data that backs whatever project your team decides to implement. Now we have analyzed and interpreted the data we received or we gathered. The next thing is to ask ourselves what we are using the findings for. And this is where you are turning the findings into actions. Here you'll be setting goals to help you address the existing problem. And it's very important to set SMART goals, as you were taught earlier. It needs to be specific, it has to be measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. So you can set, still on the case of the literacy, trying to solve literacy problems at Adewano. An example of a SMART goal we can set is to increase grade 2 reading fluency by 20% over 6 months through daily guided reading sessions. Mind you, this is specific, it is measurable, we know what we want to achieve. We are increasing reading fluency by 20%. It is time bound over the next 6 months, and it is relevant because this is informed by data that we have gathered, we just gathered. So once your objectives are clear, you need to identify the interventions, the goals, and the actual activities you're going to render to run to help you achieve these goals. Examples of activities you could do includes teacher workshop on phonics or even student workshops on phonics. You could set reading clubs. You could have literacy day activities. You could have a reading and drama club, like I mentioned earlier. You need to prioritize your intervention. Also, in setting the goals, you need to know what works for the community. Context in this case matters when you are setting the goals, because you may design an activity but may not be context relevant, and that will not help you to achieve your goal. So you have to focus on actions that address the most urgent needs and that are realistic within your available times and resources. Please do not overburden yourselves with resource laden activities if you do not have the funds or the wherewithal to carry on with the project. As much as possible, we encourage you to look within your circles to leverage support for your project. But just so you are able to continue to see your project through to the end, it's important to ensure that you have the ability to shoulder the project. And so it should be realistic and should be within your ability, within your resources, within the available times you have in the school. And so after designing your intervention, it's important as a team to sit with the secondary stakeholders, other teachers, um, the heads or school authorities, community members, to sit with them and run them through the interventions. First of all, the assumption is that they know what the findings of your data are, and based on that, you are going to run a literacy intervention. So, what exactly are the activities under this literacy intervention? Is it that students may have to stay in school 30 minutes after 3 p.m. when school closes for this intervention? You'd have to run this by the school or other stakeholders to get their buy-in and their support before you proceed with the intervention. So it's very important to share your insights with the stakeholders so that you're all aligned on one thing and nothing comes as a surprise to anybody. In planning your intervention, another wise or recommended thing to do is to set some performance indicators that helps you to track your project to see that you are getting results. And these should be just a few indicators, but should be tracked on a regular basis. So it can be a weekly um, attendance rate that you are checking. It can to see whether attendance has improved as a result of your intervention, and even in the case of the literacy, weekly reading scores, testing to see where your students are at the end of every week. This way, you have data to back your progress, or you have data to track how well your intervention is doing. It even helps you if you need to readjust your project or you need to make certain changes to see your project to the end successfully. So it's very important to hold your project accountable, or hold yourselves accountable, to ensure that you are doing the right things or you are achieving your set targets. And so far we've looked step by step at the needs assessment process. It's very important to take all of these processes seriously. And the whole bit about needs assessment, one may ask why. We need to always run a needs assessment in our community or in our schools before we roll out projects. We do not roll out projects based on our assumptions. We've heard of situations where people go into, or support persons go into communities, and based on their assumptions, they roll out interventions that even die at the beginning of the project. So it's important to do this from a data evidence driven perspective. And just to reiterate, you identify your purpose, you define your target group, then analyze and gather your data, and then you analyze and interpret your data. Once you are done, you use your findings from the data collected to define your project, the objectives of your project, or the intervention you decide on. So now we'll move on to why needs assessment matters. First of all, it ensures that your project addresses real needs, and these are not based just on assumptions. Like we mentioned earlier, for every project that a needs assessment is not done, there are chances that this project, or you are setting yourself up for failure in the middle of the project, because you may not be able to answer some questions or some bottlenecks that may stick their necks out in the process of rolling out your implementation. So a well done needs assessment helps you to address the needs, because then you're able to map solutions to the problems you have identified, and the exact strategies that will lead you to the outcome desired. It also helps to strengthen stakeholder engagement and ownership. Throughout our discussion, we've spoken about the secondary people, or the target group you're going to be working with, be it secondary or primary. It helps you to have regular engagement with them. Having done a needs assessment where your stakeholders are involved, then you are sure of getting their buy-in in the process of implementing the project itself. And that is where you're able to get the community to own the project, or your school to own the project, because they were involved right from the onset. And once you have their buy-in, you are sure that you have their support every step of the way as you implement your project. It also helps allocate resources effectively for maximum impact. And that is because you have assessed to find out where the needs of the school, where the needs of the community exist. And so every resource and every effort you are channeling into the problem you have identified is a wise one, because it is informed by evidence. And so you are allocating resources based on the problems you have identified in the class, in the school, in the community, and it won't be a waste of time and effort. It also helps to build a foundation for evidence based decision making. Evidence based decision making, highly important in every project. It sets as that foundation. Once you start assessing the needs of the community, you lay your hands on some data that may not be directly involved or affect the problem you seek to solve, and at least you have it in a pool of data somewhere, just in case you decide to solve, you decide to implement another project. So you're on a fact finding mission that leads you to implement projects resourcefully or prudently. And in the process of your project, we mentioned that you are going to set KPIs. What would these KPIs be based on? It will be based on the data you collected. And so if you say that you are creating a foundational literacy and numeracy intervention, specifically a reading club that seeks to meet after school 30 minutes, where you meet your students after school for 30 minutes. Now you'll be rolling out the intervention, and week on or week coming in and coming going out, you'll be testing whether you are meeting your goals or you are getting your desired outcome by testing your students' performance on some reading materials. And so from the onset, you have laid the foundation, you know what the problem is. In the process of your project implementation, you also are on track with your data collection. So there's accountability at every step of the project, be it in the needs assessment process or in the project implementation itself. But the needs assessment part or the data gathering part of the needs assessment sets that data and sets that foundation, because you have a baseline data that you'll be comparing the middle or the end line data you are taking to. So you can actually make a wise conclusion on whether your intervention was indeed successful, or you have to look at readjusting. And then finally, it also increases the likelihood of project success and sustainability. Once you have a needs assessment well done, it means you have followed the process of stakeholder engagement, you have collected your data, and it has started on a solid ground. And so the project, there's a likelihood that your project is going to be successful, because whatever intervention or whatever project you decided to roll out, whatever objectives you set for yourselves, whatever KPIs were not based on assumptions, but they were based on data. So you can relate that data that was collected to possible solutions to the problems. And so there's a high chance that your process, your project will see the light of day, and it's likely that we can scale it up or even um, have it in another community or a school or in a different setting. Make a few tweaks, and you're likely to be successful with it. Now, in light of the fact that capstone projects are a requirement for you to complete your fellowship, it's important to take your needs assessment seriously. A well done needs assessment makes your capstone project not just a requirement, but it becomes a meaningful contribution to your school and your community. So, as you plan your projects, remember to begin with these steps. You need to define your purpose, identify your audience, gather your data and analyze it, and use the findings to design strong um, evidence-based interventions. And that brings us to the end of this section on needs assessment. We'll meet again another time. Thank you. Your next session on this series is on proposal writing, where you will learn about the techniques to help you come up with a strong proposal that meets the eyes of funders, or that meets that's able to attract support for you. So I wish you all the best and see you another time. Bye.